Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Tate with the Southern Georgian Bay Chamber of Commerce. We really appreciate you taking the time on this Thursday evening to join us for this webinar. Very happy to welcome Brian Mabee to the Chamber of Commerce. He joined only a couple of weeks ago, and we're very happy to have him on board with some really valuable information for members. So today's webinar is Managing Human Resources and Health and Safety in the Workplace and how to keep the Ministry of Labor happy, which is something I know we all want to do. So we'll have about half an hour with Brian's presentation, then there'll be question period at the end. As well, you should note that I am recording this webinar and it will go out via social media and email tomorrow to the rest of our membership. So usually we get good viewers following the webinars. So whether you work in business or own one, dealing with human resources or occupational health and safety issues can be one of the hardest parts of our job. Learn how to manage even the trickiest HR and occupational health and safety issue with this member only. So this is a member only webinar from Peninsula, Canada. So Brian's going to talk to us about creating watertight contracts, developing workplace policies, and dealing with difficult employees, which unfortunately we probably all have encountered at one time or another. So Brian, I think I'm just going to hand that over to you now, and we'll chat at the end of the presentation.
Okay, fantastic. I just want to make sure I can go ahead and share my screen here. We'll get that set up and then so right now, am I sharing my screen?
I'm going to make you the host again, Brian, and then you should be able to do that right away.
Okay.
And yeah, we're seeing it now.
Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time to join me tonight. As Kathy has mentioned, we'll discuss basically employment relations, HR, health and safety in the workplace. What I'll try and do is keep it sort of a high-level overview of what the ministry would expect you to have in place. Ideally, what you would want to have in place if you ever have any interaction with the Ministry of Labor. Peninsula has been around for many years, originated out of the UK, been in Canada now for about 5 years, opened here in 2017. Currently, we support a little over 5,000 businesses. That's basically across Canada, with the exception of Quebec and PEI. We just haven't got into those two provinces yet. But and what we do is we basically provide health and safety support programs for small businesses. So that's, sorry, I should have advanced to this slide. That sort of just covers what I went over there. As for myself, I've been with Peninsula about 2.5 years. I'm local to the area. We're just out in the harbor here, Victoria Harbor. My background prior to Peninsula, I was in the staffing industry for the best part of 30 years. At one point, we had 5 offices across the GTA. We were supporting close to 600 assignment employees. One of my responsibilities as a managing partner was, aside from operations and recruiting, compliance. So it was my responsibility to ensure that we kept the folks at the Ministry of Labor happy. Went through numerous different levels of inspections, different types of inspections or on-site audits. So I've got a pretty good working knowledge of any provincial legislation. If there's any questions towards the end of this, we'll absolutely do our best to get them answered for you. And the idea of this webinar is to look at the idea of working together in partnership with the Southern Georgian Bay Chamber of Commerce. So to recap, or to start out, I guess, what Peninsula does is there's kind of 4 main points here. One, it's much more of a partnership. We'll provide 24/7 support. We provide all the required documentation. We'll work through that in a minute. We include legal support. So basically, we provide you documentation, we give you advice as long as you're following it. We'll back you up and put our money where our mouth is and provide legal support. I'll go over that in a bit as well. And then we include a couple of pieces of software, Bright HR and Bright Soft, and they're both designed, again, for small businesses or with small businesses in mind that may not have an HR program or anything health and safety related. And it gives you a program that sort of ties everything together. Will hit all the compliance points that you're required to maintain. And it keeps everything in a very simple digital format. I'll go over that a little bit more. We won't be demoing them tonight, but if you're interested in having a look at it, I'd be happy to set that up a little bit later. And then other parts of the service that we provide, obviously any sort of health and safety related compliance, we'll do on-site inspections. I will actually come on site and do a walkthrough. The idea is just basically to look for anything that the Ministry of Labor would pick up on and address that before that type of situation ever happens. So we'll start off by just covering what's required from a legislation standpoint. So you really have two different main pieces of legislation or acts in the workplace. The Employment Standards Act is the one that more people are familiar with, commonly referred to as just the ESA. But that's the legislation that will have all the minimum standards and minimum requirements that employers have to adhere to. Doesn't necessarily tell you, what you have to do to achieve them. It just lays out minimum standards that you have to abide by. The other legislation is commonly called the Green Book, and that's your health and safety legislation. It's called the Green Book for the simple reason it's had a green cover since 1975, but it's the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And between the two of those, that's essentially what the Ministry of Labor enforces in the workplace. There's a couple of other pieces of legislation that sort of are tied into the fabric of the employment landscape, if you will. Stuff like the Human Rights Code, Canadian Labor Code, if you're involved in the federal sector, Pay Equity Act, AOTA. This is tied very much into employment standards and human rights, and that's the Accessibility Act in Ontario. But part of what we do is just ensure that you've addressed everything up here and that we make sure everything down here ties into these two acts up here without any conflict. There are certain ways these acts work together, and in most cases, human rights will trump everything else, but there are times where health and safety will actually trump human rights. So you just have to know how those pieces go together and what takes precedent over the other. So when it comes to the HR side, the Employment Standards Act, there's basically two things that are two main pieces of documentation that all businesses should have. And I can't stress this enough here that I hear on a regular basis, we're only 6 or 7 employees. We're too small for this stuff. It only takes one to sort of spoil your day. One person one employee can cause you a lot of grief. In most cases, small businesses start small. You're either working with family or friends, everybody in the picture, and this type of thing isn't necessarily that vital at that point. I'll still say it's important regardless, but it's when the business starts to grow and you have additional people involved that you don't know. You always want to ensure that you have a contract that ties you to the Employment Standards Act minimums. The minimums are there that you have to abide by. You might as well use that legislation to your advantage. There's minimums in there as well when it comes to stuff like termination and severance. the key is you have to have a contract between you and your worker that ties you to the ESA. Without that, an employment lawyer working on behalf of the disgruntled employee will very quickly suggest that there's no connection to the ESA and it gets settled in common law. And the big concern there is common law settlements can be anywhere from 2 to 5 times as high as a typical ESA settlement. The main reason is it looks at a bunch of additional factors. The ESA settlement looks at one factor. How long has that employee been with you? If it says, if the employee's been with you 5 years, the act will say you're required to pay 5 weeks termination pay. That's capped at 8, by the way. But in a common law environment, it looks at many factors. How old the individual is, what the economic climate looks like at the time. Are there other jobs readily available in that area? There's a number of different factors, and collectively, they determine a factor or a number of weeks per year. And it could be determined that, the individual is eligible or due 4 weeks, 5 weeks per year. And that really changes that size of that settlement, especially if the individual has been with you any length of time. So having the contract in place, absolutely a critical point along the way. The other requirement would be the handbook. The handbook is basically your playbook, and I'll touch on both of these points here a little bit more detail in just a second. The playbook is, or the employee handbook is essentially your code of conduct. It covers any leaves. It's all that personnel side of it that you want to address as part of your onboarding process. The third thing is really just ongoing documentation. Anytime there's meetings, interactions, if an employee comes in late, on an ongoing basis, and you address that as a, verbal interaction followed by a first offense on a disciplinary measure. There's reasons that we do these things, and I don't want to suggest that a lot of this changes the nature of a small business. It shouldn't. A small business, a lot of them have a family feel to them. You don't have to change any of that. This just builds a little bit of structure into the organization. But that documentation is important when it comes to carrying out any sort of disciplinary measure, because there's a paper trail leading up to it. The contracts. So I've kind of already covered the main reasons here, but this just illustrates a little better between the ESA and common law. ESA settlements are very regimented, it's dictated, it's legislated, and it's clear cut. There's no gray areas to it. Common law, again, looks at all those different factors, and they all become case law. And they will look at previous settlements, and they get factored into, ongoing settlements. So it very much can become a much costlier program. Let's say somebody was with you for 15 years and that relationship went sour and you had to sever ways. On this side of the equation, you only owe 8 weeks. On this side over here, in a common law settlement, if they determine that employee, because of their age, was eligible for, let's say, 4 weeks per year, that 8-week settlement just became 60 weeks. So it's a huge, huge difference, and it's all can be eliminated just by ensuring that you've got a contract tying you to the ESA. The handbook, as I mentioned, really, that's your playbook. This is where any of your code of conduct, leaves of absence, dress code, hours of work, stat holidays, all of anything that falls under the ESA or the Human Rights Code should be addressed in here. If it's addressed in here, it's also a due diligence step on behalf of the employer that you can say you cover that with all employees as part of an onboarding process. That's the main part of it on the HR side. And then again, as I mentioned, document. Documentation is important. I'll just give you a quick example. I've seen a situation where an employee that was still within a 3-month probation period. I'll explain that in a second too, because that doesn't really exist unless you build it into your contract. But this person had a valid contract, or the company had a valid contract, and the individual was in the middle of a 3-month probation period. And actually, they were closer to the end. I think it was around the probably about the second week of the 3rd month. So they hadn't, or the 2nd month, they hadn't completed the full 3 months. Let's say they were 3/4 of the way through, and the company terminated the individual. They just felt that it was well within their rights to do that because they had included that that option to terminate the contract within the contract. What the employee did was went to an employment lawyer and argued the point that the company never provided any sort of feedback along the way. They didn't have any feedback at month 1 or at month 2, and they just terminated the individual. So the individual never had an opportunity to respond or up their performance. Make a long story short, the settlement went in behalf of the individual, and the individual was awarded, I think, 6 weeks, even though the person hadn't even been there a full 3 months. There was a settlement that they felt was fair because the employee was unfairly or unjustly terminated. So what would have changed that situation was if the company could have provided documentation at the 1-month point that they had met and reviewed that with the individual, again at the 2-month, and if the performance wasn't there, they terminated them at the 2.5-month mark, but they could have done it then with cause because there's a paper trail leading up to it. Moving on to the health and safety side. So now we're talking the Green Book, or the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The main requirements there in the workplace are going to be, again, documentation, training, workplace postings, and then just more or less carrying out and practicing the same practices or procedures in the workplace. So we'll just go over a few quick items here. So some of the workplace postings, a requirement in the workplace is a copy of the Green Book. Not sure if anybody can actually see me right now, but I'm holding up a copy of it there if you can. It's the Occupational Health and Safety Act itself. You should have a copy in the workplace. Ideally, it should be within 2020 or newer. Both the Ministry of Labor, WSIB, even CRA, they tend to look at documents 3 years of age or older as non-existent. So I'll always suggest try and keep stuff within 2 to 3 years old. Some documents you have to update annually, and I'll point them out very shortly. So some of the workplace posting requirements, again, is the Green Book. Your individual health and safety policy is a posting requirement. A work refusal policy down here is a posting requirement. Your violence and harassment policy is a posting requirement. But pretty much anything else that we have on this list. So this is covering some of the training requirements. You have WHMIS, you have the Ministry of Labor's 4-step, 5-step safety awareness. This one here is one that is largely overlooked. It's the Ministry of Labor's own program, so it's one they quite often check or look for if they're ever called on site or do on-site inspections. The 4-step is geared for employees. The 5-step should be completed by all supervisors, and I'll suggest business owners as well. The catch to this one here is the Ministry of Labor rolled this program out almost 8 years ago. It was 2014. They never attached a database. So the ministry cannot prove or identify that anybody has completed it, but the requirement was that all employers have to be able to prove that the employee has completed it. I can show you this at the end. The only way you can is to maintain a copy of a certificate. It'll have the Ontario Trillium logo on it. You can keep a PDF or a paper copy. I have both, but the idea is that's your proof that the worker has completed it. If you're hiring workers and they have a copy of that with them, that's all they need. You don't have to have them complete that again. The other training program, by the way, or programs in Ontario, along with WMIS and the 4-step, 5-step, will be violence in the workplace training. That's been a requirement here probably since about 2016. And AOTA training is the other requirement. That's one that we mentioned that earlier on the HR side. It's included from a Peninsula standpoint with the HR program because it's tied directly or more so directly to the ESA and the Human Rights Code with the accessibility requirements there. So it's more HR related. That training module resides on the HR side. But the rest of this documentation really you should have addressed in a health and safety manual. These two policies here, or rather this health and safety policy and a joint health and safety committee representative policies, these depend on the size of the business. The next slide, I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but any current health and safety manual should have all of this in there, especially stuff like this now, an infectious or contagious disease policy. It's something that the ministry is looking for every business to have implemented at this point. Really what they want is something that if, tomorrow morning the Ford government shuts down everybody, there's a program in place that the employees know what to sort of implement, as soon as they're back into the workplace. PPE policies, again, that's going to be something you want to make sure is updated to pandemic requirements, even though we're sort of looking at COVID more in the rear view mirror now than looking out the front, but it should be addressed for any future requirements. Workplace inspections and reporting, really ideally should be done on a monthly basis. If you're doing stuff monthly, it's very difficult for them to ever, hold any sort of negligence against you for not doing workplace inspections. Depending on the size of the business, you can get away with doing it quarterly. My concern there is quarterly. Sometimes, you miss the quarterly meeting, we'll catch the next one. Now it's 6 months in between. If you do it monthly, it just keeps everything much more current. So this is what This is what I was mentioning. The ministry will categorize any business in Ontario. You'll fall into one of 3 categories. The smallest being 1 to 5 employees, very popular category. It's actually one of the most popular categories that Peninsula has as well. But in the 1 to 5 category, there's no requirement to have a designated health and safety rep. So you still have to comply with any of the Green Book requirements, any employment legislation. There's just no requirement to have a health and safety rep, and any health and safety related activities can be carried out by the business owner in that smallest category. Once we move up into this 6 to 19 employee range, the biggest difference there is you're required to have a designated health and safety rep. And that's, I'll use the term elected over here. The Green Book will say that is a voice of the workers, and the workers elect their rep. So it's not a situation where you can hand pick the person for the job. In some cases, that would probably be a better solution, but to be compliant, the idea is you would rally the troops. Everybody nominates who they think would be the best voice for them, and the person with most nominations gets to wear that hat. Hopefully it's something they want to do, and really the main functionality there is that monthly workplace inspection, Plus, they're a go-to for anybody that has health and safety concerns or wants to report something. They can report it to that individual, and that individual brings those up either in a timely fashion or at the next meeting, depending on the nature of the incident or whatever the occurrence may be. Once your business gets into this bigger category, the higher category of 20 plus, the big difference there is you're required to form a joint health and safety committee, and you have one member on the management side that is going to be trained and certified, and one, again, elected worker rep or employee rep. And same thing there, there's training and certification required for both positions. And then there is a requirement to meet monthly. There's a requirement to post the monthly meetings, post the minutes of the monthly meetings. So just a few extra workplace postings once you get into that larger category. As for the documentation side when it comes to health and safety, your health and safety manual should really cover anything that's in the green book that a Ministry of Labor inspector could hold you accountable for. The idea is if you look at addressing anything in the green book and any hazards in the workplace, there's very little that should ever end up on a work order if something does take place in the workplace and the ministry is called to inspect or do whatever the situation may be. The outcome of that should be much more positive because the health and safety manual basically addresses anything that's in the green book and anything that's a requirement in the workplace. So if you've addressed all the hazards, in some cases, you might want to implement safe work procedures if you've got specific hazards or a specific way that you want employees to complete a process, implementing a safe work procedure, sometimes also called SOPs or standard operating procedure. You have the worker sign off on stuff like that. That's actually, I've got that mentioned down here, SOPs, but it's an additional step that builds in an additional layer of due diligence on behalf of the business owner as well. But obviously, the health and safety policy, it's a workplace posting requirement that should be top and center in any health and safety manual. A work refusal, again, a posting requirement. You want to have procedures on handling any PPE, infectious diseases. Again, this is just covering all the points of the green book. You address whether or not you have a health and safety rep or whether you're into the joint health and safety committee space. If you have safe work procedures, you want those signed. That's a very strong due diligence step, and most larger employers, any employees that operate any specific equipment will always sign off on an SOP. It's the business's way of proving that the employee completed the required training or was given the required direction to complete the task safely. Training. I've already touched on this a little bit earlier, but these are the 4 mandatory training programs in Ontario. The first one here is, as I mentioned earlier, it's the Ministry of Labor's own program. The 4 steps should be completed by all employees or workers, and the 5-step by any supervisors. Keep your certificate. It's a one-time requirement. I had originally completed this in 2014. I had lost my certificate, so I completed it again in 2019 when I started with Peninsula. My tickets here, I've got paper copies. They'll never expire as long as I have them. These 3 down here, we will suggest update annually. These 2, absolutely annually. So violence in the workplace, it should be part of an onboarding process. So workers would complete that as part of the onboarding training. And the same with AOTA, a little more HR related, but I've included it here just so that it shows up as mandatory training. WHMIS, this is the only one that's really optional. So let's say you are in the food business and you have nothing in the your facility that is not food grade. So there's nothing in there that's stronger than any sort of typical cleaning products, WHMIS training would not be required. But if you add something as simple as bleach, now WHMIS is a requirement. Bleach, although it's a consumer commodity for us, we can all pick up a jug of Clorox, bring it home, no questions asked. But when it comes into the workplace, it becomes a class 7 corrosive with acidic qualities. And for that reason, would require safety glasses, gloves, possibly a smock, more so to protect your clothes. But the idea is there would be a training requirement because bleach would fall under the WHMIS regulated product program. So anything, if you order any product from a supplier and it comes with an SDS sheet attached, which is a acronym for safety data sheet, that's a telltale sign that that's a WHMIS regulated product. And at that point should, or I would highly recommend all workers be WHMIS trained. The biggest downfall or pitfall to not providing this training is in the event of an accident happening. And let's say somebody, I'll use bleach as an example, splashed bleach in their eye and had to, seek medical attention. And that can be serious. I mean, you could potentially lose sight in an eye. As an employer, you would never want to be in a position where somebody identifies the fact that the worker was not provided any WHMIS training. The result of that would not bode well for the employer, and they'd be held literally accountable for the accident. Whereas if the training is provided and the PPE is provided, the employer has done everything that's been required of them. If I still manage to splash bleach in my eye, it looks like, well, not it looks like, it's because I've caused that problem myself. It's not because the employer failed to take any necessary due diligence steps. So again, just to recap, one time only, keep that certificate. These three here, we recommend, again, onboarding and then annually update it. If you're paying for WHMIS, those cards are generally good for 2 years less a day. If you're paying for the program, then I would stick with the 2-year program. No need to incur extra cost. The reason we recommend annual updates is we include all this training as part of our OHS program. The software that we provide actually puts the training programs right into the employee's hands. It's all in an e-learning library. So other workplace requirements. So posting requirements, I pretty much always also covered that. What I didn't really mention here was the Health and Safety Board. Not all companies are aware of this, but there should be a Health and Safety Board in your shop, in the warehouse, in the office, somewhere. Generally, it's in a lunchroom, but that's where all those workplace postings should be. Most inspectors will generally ask to see the Health and Safety Board because at a quick glance, it tells them how proactive that business is when it comes to health and safety. I can walk into any business and at a quick glance of the Health and Safety Board determine whether or not anybody's paying attention to it just based on what's on the board and the date of the documents. Those 3 documents, the health and safety, work refusal, and violence in the workplace, all require annual review and updates. So the dates on those should never be much more than 12 months from the calendar date you're looking at it. But the other requirements are going to be stuff like first aid, CPR. So depending on the size of the business, there's training requirements. The lower category in that 1 to 15. Again, it's a different numbering system there. The ministry does that 1 to 5, 6 to 19 when it comes to health and safety reps. But when it comes to first aid, it's based on 1 to 15 employees, 16 to 49. So those requirements will vary. In the back of the green book under Regulation 1101, it'll tell you exactly what those requirements are. First aid on site varies based on the size of the business again. The larger the business, the more those requirements are. Again, regulation 1101 sort of tells you exactly what you have to have, but most businesses in that 1 to 15 range are required to have one person first aid, CPR trained and certified. Those are generally good for a 2 to 3 year window. And then you want to have that first aid kit on site as well. Fire safety plans. So here's one other thing that is a workplace posting, your emergency response plan. And this one, it's one of those things I've met with small businesses. Some might be a 900 square foot office with 2 or 3 accountants with a front door and a back door. Do they really need an emergency response plan? Well, not really. If there's fire and smoke in one door, you're going the other direction. But if we were to put it together a health and safety program for that accounting firm, we would include an emergency response plan, simply because the green book says you're supposed to have it. So if we address everything that's in the green book, again, there's little that can end up on that potential work order. So posting an emergency response plan is always a wise idea. It should also include, in the event of, natural gas leak, do this. In the event of fire, do that. Fire drills. Here's another one that a lot of small businesses don't realize is a requirement, but you have a requirement to do an annual fire drill, basically where you sound the fictitious alarm and everybody exits the building and meets at the muster point, and then you document it. It's one of those things that probably the only time it would ever come to surface is if you had a fire in the business and somebody maybe had problems getting out or got hurt getting out. What would come to surface was, when was the last time a fire drill was done? It's just one of those due diligence steps that if anybody's worked for any larger businesses in the past, most larger companies that will have a health and safety department, they'll be on this and they will conduct an annual fire drill, and it's quite simply just to be compliant with the green book. The rest of fire safety is just making sure your extinguishers are, now that you have extinguishers in the workplace, they should be tagged. When I say tagged, that basically means somebody is coming in on an annual basis from a fire prevention services company and tagging that. And they should come in once a year, just update it. That's a green book requirement. If the business is in that 6 to 19 or 20 plus range and has a health and safety rep or committee, I recommend on a monthly basis, the health and safety rep check those fire extinguishers. It's a common practice for most businesses to do. That same rep would generally also check first aid requirements and ensure that that's always up to date. And those are requirements as well of the green book. But that rounds out most of the the health and safety requirements in the workplace. I mean, aside from the obvious, keeping the workplace clean and, the obvious visual hazards in the workplace. But this is more or less addressing what the Ministry of Labor can hold you accountable for. And in a perfect world, what the Ministry of Labor would like to find, if they're ever called to your workplace. And again, that's what you would want to be able to sort of suggest when they get there, is that, yes, this is what we have in place, because the outcome of that meeting or that interaction will always be much more positive when they can address or when they see that you've addressed basically what the minimum requirements are. I'll just kind of recap that. What I've covered so far is really, again, what the Ministry of Labor, that's what the minimum requirements are for businesses, based on that 1 to 5, 6 to 19 size. What Peninsula does is basically put together programs for small businesses that don't have anything established, HR or health and safety. And we basically cover 4 main points when we do that, whether it's on the HR side of the fence or on the health and safety side. So your documentation on the HR side, it'll be your contracts and your employee handbook, and that's basically addressing the ESA and the Human Rights Code. On the health and safety side, your health and safety manual will cover and address any of the policies and hazards in the workplace, and that addresses the ES or the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The advice side, I haven't really explained that yet, how that works. But with Peninsula, it is very much more of a partnership. It's based on a monthly subscription, and I'll get into that in a minute. But part of this service is 24/7 advice. We're 24/7 because we have clients that run around the clock. They have shifts around the clock, so we have to be there for them. So you can call on the landing page of both pieces of our software, and I'll gladly demo them for anybody that's interested in seeing it at another time. But the landing page will have an 833 number. You call that whenever you have a problem. You literally will get somebody like myself. I'll answer the phone. I'll ask you what the problem, explain what the circumstances are, and then we give you a resolution in real time. If you're required to, if you need any sort of documentation to support that, let's say it was maybe a disciplinary measure, I generate the documentation, or we generate the documentation. We'll forward it to you as basically just a white document. You print it on your letterhead. You will always still be the employer of record. You are still the employer. All we're doing is basically playing an HR manager or a health and safety manager. The difference is we're not sitting in your office. We're remotely connected either by Zoom or by phone, whatever it might be. But the idea of that advice line, it's there whenever you have a question. We ask, don't go to Google. There's nothing wrong with Google. You'll get all kinds of answers, but sometimes you'll get more than you need, and then you have to determine what works best for you. And the idea of this advice line here is we'll provide you the solution, we'll provide you the advice, the documentation. All we ask at that point is just follow that advice through. And as long as you're doing that, this here covers the outcome of that decision. So Peninsula Protect is our internal commitment. It's our promise that if you're following our advice, using our documentation, if a challenge, legal case, or claim is brought against the business related to the ESA, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or for that matter, employment in general, we will provide $125,000 worth of legal support to resolve that issue. That's per claim, and that's capped at $500,000 per year. Right now, just to put that into perspective, I believe we are following 114 cases as of the beginning of October. That's Canada-wide. That's not 114 times that we have messed up. That's 114 times where an employer has had a challenge, a claim, some sort of legal case brought against the business, and we're resolving it for them. Most of those will be resolved in the employer's favor. They could be the likes of constructive dismissal or wrongful dismissal, but the point is we'll resolve that. And like I say, most of them will be resolved in the employer's favor. The nice part about it is that's 114 businesses that won't be stuck with a legal bill at the end of it. And finally, it's the software. So Bright HR and Bright Safe, like I say, I wish I had more time to demo them for you. They're very user-friendly. The HR program, Bright HR, can be used for everything from just an employee platform, database, document tab. All your certificates sit there. You can use it for scheduling. Employees use that software to book time off. Very, very user-friendly, very interactive. Bright Safe is a piece of software. It's actually a module connected to Bright HR, so you can toggle back and forth very easily. We can push information back and forth from one software to the other quite seamlessly. Bright Safe will cover anything that is a requirement in your business that the Ministry of Labor can hold you accountable for. It covers stuff like running risk assessments, hazard reporting, safe work procedures, injury, illness tracking. and it has an e-learning library. The e-learning library has about 26 different training programs. The 4 mandatory ones you're going to find there. Sorry, I stand corrected. The 3 mandatory ones, the 4-step, 5-step, violence in the workplace, and WMIS are in that library. AOTA is connected to our HR program, so that training module is on the HR side, accessible through Bright HR here. But again, the idea of those softwares are, it's a cloud-based app. Everybody in the business downloads it, employees included, and employees have access to those training modules. There's no cost to any of the training modules. The idea there is cost shouldn't be a barrier when it comes to compliance. It's interactive. Employees can take those programs literally whenever they want, or you can sort of mandate them to them and suggest what they have to take. But I'd gladly demo those at a later date. My next slide here is just kind of covering what we've sort of just discussed here with Bright HR and Bright Safe. These are just a couple more features of Bright HR and Bright Safe. Blip is a time and attendance tracking part of Bright HR, so you can use it as a time and attendance program as well. POP is designed for tracking expenses in the workplace, so if any employees track mileage or any sort of expenses, they can submit it all through the software, and it's very seamless. You can approve it. Well, I'd have to demo that for you to get a better understanding of it, but it's all included as part of the program. And just to give you a little bit of an idea on what cost looks like, it's a monthly subscription, but it's based on a couple of different factors. 1, the number of employees. 2, what you're interested in, whether it's HR, health and safety, or full compliance. And 3, the term. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a partnership agreement with Peninsula. We look at anywhere from a 12-month to a 60-month term. The 60-month term, I'll be quite honest, is always going to be the best bet. It is the most cost-effective. Most businesses, if they're looking at bringing us on for support, it's more of a partnership. It's something that you almost have to recognize that there is a certain need there to support HR and health and safety on an ongoing basis. And that's really the idea of that advice line, is to connect you to a health and safety manager or HR manager that's there around the clock whenever you need them. The nice part about it is if something does go wrong and you're following the advice, the Peninsula Protect covers you from ever having to bring an employment lawyer into the situation again. If I think back to the days in staffing, there were many times where I needed legal support. I would bring an employment lawyer in, even back prior to I got out of staffing in 2018, and I think I was paying $485 an hour back then for one of the upper level lawyers for representation, and we include all that. So it sort of covers, it's similar to hiring an employee, somebody that's got an HR health and safety background, without the salary. So just to sort of recap there, these are based on the 60-month program, but if your business had 1 to 5 employees, the cost would be about $445 a month. So you're looking at approximately $5,000 a year to manage all of this with legal support. And I always like to draw the similarity when I was in staffing. I would hire somebody to manage this. We might have been paying back then probably in the $70,000 a year range to manage all of this. But if they messed up, we still had to go to an HR or an employment lawyer to straighten that out. The nice part about this is we sort of cover any sort of legal costs. And it's nice because I believe we're the only consulting company in Canada that will back up our advice and guidance. We're the only ones that will provide legal support. And essentially, if we provided the grief, will fix the problem. This is just kind of covering a few more of the benefits of membership. I think I've probably covered all these at one point or another. I mean, we are building and maintaining. That's key right there, maintaining. We will constantly maintain any sort of documentation. So we're sort of keeping an eye constantly on what's going on at Queen's Park. As legislation changes, we are updating employee handbooks. We're updating health and safety manuals to ensure that they remain compliant. So they will always be updated annually. 24/7 advice we've already covered. Access to the software. Again, I'd love to show you that, but we'll do that another day. And the nice part about the software is it becomes your record-keeping tool. Essentially, you can transfer and upload the software, are cloud-based apps, so you can upload whatever we want to them. But you could essentially transition a health and safety or HR program to one of these two platforms and pretty much maintain it in a digital environment. My next slide here is one I often like to ask people. If an ML inspector were to knock on your door today, do you feel your business would be compliant? Is there anything that potentially could end up on a work order? I always say the time to sort that out is before they ever knock on your door. When I go back to staffing, back to the late 80s, early 90s, we never really addressed much in the line of health and safety or HR until we went through 3 or 4 interactions with the ministry. And eventually we figured out we were visible enough that if we were going to be in business, they were going to be back. So we decided, you know what, let's address what they're looking for. And at that point, we sort of put together a program, that addressed everything back then. Essentially, that's exactly what Peninsula does today. So I have done a lot of talking. I would love to open it up for questions and answers. Kathy, I'm not sure if I have to do anything to do that.
Yeah, maybe, Brian, at this point, if you want to just stop sharing and we'll just see if there's any anything in the chat from the audience or questions from them. So if you wanted to stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay, so if anybody has questions, now would be the time. You can either ask them straight out or put them in the chat and I will ask them. Maybe I'll start it off, Brian. So the Chamber of Commerce, we have anywhere from 2 to say 4 employers. So we're definitely under that 5 employee threshold that you mentioned. So just curious, what is our requirement for first aid training, CPR, that type of thing?
So you'd want to have one person with a current first aid certification. They're usually good for 3 years. There's lots of different places, you can acquire that, whether it's St. John's or Life Beats. But you'd want to have one person first aid CPR trained and certified. Then you'd have what's called a small first aid kit. That regulation 1101 at the back of this here green book will sort of break that down. And there is what's called a small, medium, large first aid kit. So you would have that small one, and it basically includes everything in there that is a requirement for you to have at that point. And then the requirement is just to ensure that it gets replenished as stuff comes out of it. I've only ever seen once where the ministry actually, that I was aware of anyway, where they levied a fine against a business for having a non-compliant first aid kit. But it was a situation where the first aid kit was buried under literally debris when they found it. It was covered in dust. And when you opened it, there was very little in it. There was a couple of rolls of gauze, and you could tell it had been, ransacked over the years and nobody had ever replenished it. And as a result, they said, you know what, well, we'll get your attention with this. And there was probably like a $350 fine, but you know what, if you can avoid that just by sort of I always suggested just keep a little log in there. So if I take out something today, it may sound petty, but I would put on there what I took out, because then on a monthly basis, if somebody's flipping that open, they can see what came out. It's very easy to put something back in. The other option for all of this, which I often suggest is maybe even a better idea, is buy 2 kits. Use one and have one that you provide the Ministry of Labor if they ever knock on your door. That way you have one that is always full, and you have one.
There's a trick of the trade, Brian.
It's compliant. There's nothing wrong with it, because you have a kit there that is that has absolutely everything that it's supposed to, and you have another one that you're working with. You know, the cost of the kit's probably $19.99 or something like that. It's not expensive. It's a simple solution. It's a workaround anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Anybody else with questions? It's like we've got a quiet crowd here, Brian. I have one other question, which is just out of curiosity. Under employment contracts, you called something a frustration clause. What's a frustration clause?
So a frustration clause is, let's say somebody was off on some sort of a job protected leave. Maybe they were off on a medical leave with, I'm trying to think of something here that would allow them to be off. Let's say it was just some sort of disease, doesn't matter. They were off on agreed upon leave that they were going to be off for, let's say 3 months, and you know, everything would be back to normal and they're going to be back to their job. Well, at the 2-month mark, let's say that employee is involved in a car accident. Now that car accident has put them in a position where there's no way they can return to work at that 3-month mark. The whole leave of absence that was provided is going to be in a frustrated state because that worker can't come back. It's for something outside of what the original reason was, but there's something in there that is preventing that worker from coming back. And you always should address what that escape clause looks like, because if you don't, you're leaving it up to an employment lawyer to argue that on behalf of the worker at that point.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope I didn't bore everybody.
No, you know, that was really, it was very useful information, no matter what size of business it seems. So
it's kind of one of those things where you're never too small for it. Even, you know, I always just say it only takes one person to sometimes upset your cart for the day.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so if there aren't any questions from the audience, I think we'll close, Brian. And again, this has been recorded, and I'll be sending it out tomorrow via social media and also via our e-newsletter to the membership. So if people want to reach out to you, Brian, how would they do that?
So you can connect with me through the chamber, or I can sort of respond to anybody with some sort of a contact page if you like. I mean, I can be reached by cell. I can give you the cell number. Do you want me to put this out right here over the?
So maybe, I mean, you can do, but also when we send this out tomorrow, again, we will definitely include your coordinates, your phone number, your email address, website, all that good stuff. So, yeah, I think
I can be reached anyway by cell or email. If somebody wants me to drop by and sort of demo the software in person, I'm 10 minutes away. I can do that as well.
Yeah, it's great that you're locally based out of Victoria Harbor. So, and you know the region. So,
yep,
all
absolutely.
right. So thank you so much for that information. Very, very useful for our membership. And we appreciate all your support and look forward to working with you. And thank you to everybody who joined us for the webinar. And I think I will sign off at that point.
Yes, thank you very much again.
All right. Have a great night.
You too. Take care.
Bye.